KTCA TV, St. Paul, Minneapolis, Channel 2.
Night Times is made possible in part by a grant from the Northwest Area Foundation. Live from the Twin Cities, this is Night Times Magazine with Mary Stuckey and Michael Boyle.
Good evening, and thanks for joining us. Tonight on Night Times Magazine, we'll find out what you can do if you have a complaint against the news media. And I'll report on some of the problems of romance in the workplace.
I'll also talk with a folklorist about the origins of our New Year's celebrations, and cartoonist Richard Ginden will reveal some surprising new facts about St. Paul. But first, something purely visual and musical from mime artist Rick Shope, who scaled a building in downtown Minneapolis to give us his view from the top.
About a month ago, Howard Kaseme made headlines when he resigned as Minnesota's Commissioner of Education. Kaseme said
Laws governing this problem?
There are, and last year the state Supreme Court interpreted laws to mean that a company can't refuse to hire a person simply because his or her spouse already works for that company. But there are loopholes that say that they can do that if it would jeopardize the business in some way.
But what about unmarried people who are living together, who are sharing a very close relationship, who work in the same company?
Well, that isn't covered by the law, and that's what married couples are complaining about.
What I'm wondering about is when you went to these companies, what did they respond when you asked them, do you have this problem here? What's your policy?
Several of them said, this is a media issue. You're blowing this all out of proportion. We don't have that many couples that this affects. But clearly, couples are concerned and will be.
And continue to be concerned. Well, I suppose as women enter the marketplace...
That's right.
You know, there's a conflict of interest. Let's say two lawyers were dating, and they were on either side of an issue.
Certainly, it's extending further than just a company. And in the old days, women worked at home. This is going to be more and more of an issue as they enter the workforce.
Certainly. Thanks, Mary. In an earlier appearance on Night Times, Twin Cityologist Richard Ginden revealed some of the subtle differences between Minneapolis and St. Paul. Tonight, he continues his observations on Minnesota's unidentical twins.
Even though I work and live in Minneapolis, I was born and raised in St. Paul. I'm a St. Paul native. That's my hometown. Minneapolis is kind of a hard city to figure out. It's a bit of a shock to me when I first moved across the river and came over here. I think I have a little better feeling about what the city's like. It helps to know something about its history. It was settled, essentially, by two types of people. The first type were those who could not stand the pace of the big city of St. Paul and wanted to get away from it all. They became commuters, moved over to Minneapolis, and gave their daughter baton lessons. The second type, and the reason that Minneapolis is often referred to as Mill City, as some of the early settlers, were single males who enjoyed baking. Minneapolis had a function and continues to have a function It serves as St. Paul's Bloomington. It's a place where married men from St. Paul can go and fool around. St. Paul's a much older town than Minneapolis. It has a lot of famous people who have come from there, F. Scott Fitzgerald, most notably, Albert Schweitzer, Eleanor Roosevelt, and Winston Churchill. And that's why most of the streets in St. Paul are named after dead people. In Minneapolis, most of the streets are named after famous numbers.
Have you ever wondered why the new year begins in the dead of winter? Or why many people celebrate the holiday by drinking too much? Joining us in the studio is folklorist Ellen Steckert, who teaches at the University of Minnesota. She is here to provide some insights into how some of our New Year's holiday customs came to be. Michael?
Ellen, why do we celebrate New Year's in the dead of winter?
I think just because it's the dead of winter, I think if you look back historically, you'll see that people were very close to the earth, and they knew that the sun was getting farther and farther away, and there was a certain point at which it would turn around and start to come back, and for fear of it never coming back, to start things all over again, they would celebrate and coax it back.
So this is connected with light, with the days getting longer. That's the reason for celebration.
In some instances, there are some cultures that did, and still do, practice. For example, the ecclesiastical Jewish New Year starts in March, but keep it simple.
Yeah.
And say that most of our New Years that we think of in this country do start in the mid of winter.
Okay, I don't associate lights too much with New Year's. Do we have any examples in contemporary folklore where light appears as a motif?
I remember one very much from my childhood. I don't know if you can recall it, but we used to all wait up very, very late at night on New Year's, which was meant 12 o'clock, and we would wait for a ball on the top of the New York Times building, then
Right.
Times Square, to come plunging down. And ironically, if you read in the histories, you find out that there's a tradition in Scotland and in many other places of lighting tar barrels, or men carrying light on their head to celebrate the incoming New Year. In other words, to coax the sun to come back.
What about the idea of getting looped, drunk, inebriated on New Year's Eve? Does that have any folkloric tradition to it?
Oh, of course. I mean, there's got to be some kind of dignified tradition between that and
It's good to hear.
then and now. Well, I think what you've got is the whole complex of the sort of festivals of harvest and the festivals about the anxiety of the sun not returning, all sort of merging together. And when you look at crops and the magic of bringing the sun back, what's more magical than the crops fermenting? And you find records way, way back complaining about the boisterousness, the drinking. The medieval literature is crammed full of complaints by the church about how people should not behave in such an ungainly manner. In fact, you might be interested to know that with the Puritans coming to this country and founding a good number of our colleges, that there was never a Christmas holiday at college in Boston, for example, until 1870.
What do people do other than get totally zonked in this country now? I mean, are there any traditions that remain?
Oh, there are numerous traditions that I think a lot of people are not aware of. I was up in a county in the northern part of the state, northwestern part, Kitson County, and I was asking people there when I was talking to them about customs what they did at New Year's, and someone said, well, we go Eula bucking. And I said, what? And they said, Eula bucking. I said, well, do all of you know what Eula bucking is? And they all started to laugh. It was a very small group, and they all knew the story. And one woman said, well, the State Patrol certainly doesn't know what Eula bucking is. And I said, well, tell me, what happened? Well, excuse me. It turns out that Eula bucking goes back to a very old tradition of trying to entice the New Year back by doing plays, by people dressing up in masks, and mumming, it was called. They would go into people's houses, they would get, they would do, outrageous things like, they would be all men, bachelors, and they would sit on the laps of the lady of the house, give her a hug right in front of her husband, do things that were slightly outlandish in order to get finally identified, and then be given drinks or money and then leave for the next house, taking the inhabitants of that house along equally bizarrely dressed. Well, in this country it survives as Belschnickling amongst Germans and Eula bucking amongst Scandinavians. And in this town in Kennedy, there was a group of very prominent citizens. Oh, I named the town, didn't I? I wasn't
Yes.
going to do that. Well, there were a group of prominent...
I forgot it.
Yes, I forgot it, too. They were going out about a quarter of a mile out of town, all dressed up to Utebuch. And they knew the family they were going to, and one person, very prominent person, had a ice cream bucket over her head and was dressed completely in tinfoil. And as another person said, and everybody else was just dressed just as stupidly. And the state patrol car came whizzing along and screeched to a halt and said, "What are you doing?" "Well, now, you're not supposed to be identified." So they said, "Utebuching," disguising their voices. And finally, the state patrolman obviously was not responding to this, and one of the people in the group said, "Well, I think we'd better be straight and tell them what we're doing." And they did, and he still didn't believe them. He followed them all the way to the house, all the way through town for an hour and a half, and the punchline of the joke, when everybody was laughing, telling me, the outsider, was they wondered really what his final report looked like when he got back to the station.
Well, Ellen, given some experiences I've had on other New Year's Eves, I think I'll go Eulabooking this year. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for
Mary?
having me.
When you see or read a news story that you think is unfair, what action can you take? You could file suit against the news organization, a costly and often lengthy process. Or you can waive all rights to a lawsuit and take your complaint to the Minnesota News Council, a unique organization which rules on complaints brought against the media in Minnesota. Producer Bill Hanley has this report.
Administering justice has never been an easy task. Imagine balancing the legal rights of one party against those of another, guided only by contradictory statutes and hazy legal precedents. But consider then for a moment the plight of the 9-year-old Minnesota News Council.
For the News Council, the job is not to assess legalities or illegalities, but rather to weigh the quality of individual news articles or stories against some hopefully objective standard of fairness. To say the least, it is a very difficult job.
I'm Jim Hetland, and I'm going to be chairing this hearing. I'm a public member of the Press Council. The Council is a forum to determine accuracy and fairness of media, electronic and print media reporting. It is also a place in which citizens can conveniently, without a lot of cost, raise their complaints. So what it's doing, it acts as a sounding board and then exercises judgment. The driving force were a group of newspaper editors and publishers from the Minnesota Newspaper Association. They decided that something should exist other than the courts as a process to determine media fairness. And it's kind of an outgrowth of this whole movement towards corporate responsibility.
4 of the 7 Hennepin County Commissioners were up at the crack of dawn this morning. This event summit was shrouded in secrecy. It was a meeting including County Commission Chairwoman Nancy Ocon and 3 independent Republican-backed board members. Unlike other board meetings, notices were not sent to the news media. News Center 11 found out about the meeting, however, through government center sources.
I was sitting in my office, and I had WTCN on, and they did this story claiming that there was a meeting shrouded in secrecy in the government center. And certainly a very misleading story. Didn't mention anything about the official notice that had been published.
Hennepin County Commissioner Randy Johnson's complaint against WTCN's handling of the story involved 2 issues.
The event summit was shrouded in secrecy.
First, use of the term somewhat shrouded in secrecy to describe the meeting in question. And second, the alleged failure of WTCN to fully air Johnson's views on the matter in a subsequent story. When the station refused his demand for a retraction, Johnson took his complaint to the News Council.
I believe that the issue before the News Council is really quite simple. Did WTCN, as it claimed, clearly demonstrate an effort to permit all sides of this question to be articulated? I think not. I think our community has a right to expect a higher professional standard than was displayed by WTCN on these 2 broadcasts.
But the Minnesota News Council is not a court of law. It has no power to fine or punish newsmen. In fact, it can't even force them to participate. So why do people like Randy Johnson turn to the News Council at all?
I think it has a deterrent effect on other reporters who are out to sensationalize without having done their homework and without having a factual basis.
Why not sue the station? But you give up your right to sue, obviously.
I think that the News Council provides an arbitrator's informality. Don't get hung up in the rules of evidence. I'm a lawyer. I know what it is to go to court. It's expensive. I can't afford to sue WTCN and a multi-million-dollar corporation.
But we didn't say that the meetings were illegal. We said that Commissioner Darris said the meetings might be illegal. We also didn't say the meetings were shrouded in secrecy. We said they were somewhat shrouded in secrecy. There is a difference there.
From the other perspective, news people often submit themselves to review by the News Council simply because they believe they're correct. In this case, for example, WTCN even took the unusual step of showing the council the entire unedited interview with Randy Johnson in order to prove that they had treated him fairly.
All right. First of all, Commissioner Johnson, I want to just know if you think this was, consistent with open government, the one little ad that you got here.
Well, the meeting that fully with the open meeting law requirements.
I wonder about any kind of an agency getting into the editor's head and second guessing. I think it's very easy to have 20/20 hindsight in this business. The somewhat shrouded in secrecy line was a part of the lead-in to this story. The business about the circumstances of the meeting being held was part of the tag to the story, and there was balance in that.
But despite the informal nature of the News Council, and despite the fact that its findings amount to little more than a slap on the wrist for newsmen, there exists in the Twin Cities an unusual and spirited debate among some media executives over whether the council should exist at all. Generally, it's been the electronic media which has been most reluctant to cooperate with the News Council. The most outspoken critic of the council has been President and General Manager of KSTP-TV, Stanley S. Hubbard.
I don't need a press council, and we don't need a press council, and you don't need a press council to tell us how to run our news operation. We have laws. We have libel laws in this land. And those of us who are broadcasters have to deal with Federal Communications Commission. We have equal time laws. We have the fairness doctrine. There's nothing official about the press council any more than there was about Hitler's brown shirts. They have no official status, and they are not hearings, as far as we're concerned, unless they have an official status. We don't consider them hearings. We consider it a kangaroo court. And I know that first you'll have a press council, and then you'll have a government-approved press council, and the next thing you know, you'll have a government-appointed press council. And I don't think that any place in our country should there be a press council. They have press councils in Poland and Yugoslavia and Russia. I don't think we have room for press councils here.
Many newspaper people, on the other hand, see a voluntary news council as the best possible alternative to unconstitutional government controls. Charles Bailey is editor of the Minneapolis Tribune.
I know the television people didn't like it when the council reached out to suggest that it ought to entertain complaints about their performance. They'll learn to love the press council, too. To say that there's no need for a medium as powerful and as influential as television, or a medium as influential as the only newspaper in a major metropolitan city like this, to say that institutions like that don't need to be looked at by society is nonsense. But I think too many journalists forget that we only have freedom of the press. The First Amendment is only as good as the public wants it to be in the long run.
The News Council is still considering the complaint against WTCN-TV and hasn't announced a decision. But James Hetland, vice chairman of the council, told KTCA today that a majority of the council members seem to feel WTCN was within the bounds of fairness in reporting the story.
In preparing your New Year's resolutions, some of you may be thinking of ways to simplify